Getting exciting. Hello, Isaac.
Oh, Rabbi, good morning. So good to see you.
Wow, we've been on this mound for months. Uh, so we finally finished the section
On fa on
on
fasting.
fasting, and
Hmm.
now our next section is going to be focused on possessions. We focused first, very in the hierarchy of the world, the way we're supposed to go. We focused first on religious actions, and now we're going to focus on somewhat the physical world, or possibly the rejection of it. Usually we have, I think, more concrete interpretations. Today, I think we're going to go and present three interpretations that are two possibilities. So it's exciting to be able to say, like, I have no clue what this is talking about, and we'll have to kind of give two possible reads for at least three of the concepts that we're going to read as we read the next three verses.
On that note, the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 6, verse 19 onwards. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and dust destroy, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.
It's funny, when my kids were watching a show yesterday, they saw a thief broke into a house for $100 bill, and they were wondering. They go, "Would a thief break in for such a small matter?" And I said, "Well, based on Matthew 6:19, it does seem that a moth is usually associated with clothing. It did seem that thieves in the olden days would break in for smaller amounts. Obviously, I didn't quote Matthew 6:19, but I think that it's very interesting. The idea of how we relate to thieves today is ever evolving based on the benefit that thieves get from various the stealings that take place. So sometimes it's hard for us to relate. But yes, the main reason that you'd lose stuff in the olden day is that it was destroyed or it was stolen. But sorry, would you like to say something?
Yeah, so let's set the context, right? The audience at this time, they were not affluent. They were ordinary people. Maybe there was a small portion which was affluent. Now you and I, we live in New York. There's so much wealth in this again in this country, in the state, and so yeah, this probably has more application to us, I would say, than the first century people who came around to visit them. And so I'm intrigued, like, what do these words even mean to them? they,
Right.
they they're not people with affluence. They're most, at least in some of the mount, they're ordinary people. There were instances where the rich young ruler came to Jesus, say,
Well, I
"What?
think you're
Yeah, go
making a
ahead."
good question, right? What does this mean? So
Yeah,
the fact that losing possessions of earth, I think, is clear today. Floods happening, destroying property. There's no question. But I think the main question that you're trying to allude to is, what does it mean, treasures? Because when you look at all the translation, the word in Greek is treasures, and it could have said possessions. There is a Greek word for possessions. There's a normal word for property. It actually did say treasures, and I think the word treasures is specifically chosen because I think when we think of the word treasures, it doesn't mean a regular property. So I feel like we'll start by asking you, and then I'll give you some rabbinic texts that have some parallels to say, what does it mean to say treasures when lay not up your treasures upon earth? Don't keep your treasures. What are treasures, Isaac?
that's a very good. So I don't think there's any one treasure. Historically, I probably have taken this to mean possessions, as in physical possessions. Again, either wealth or housing or property or kind of or other forms of physical, material wealth. But I don't, when you ask this question, I don't think that's what you're referring to. That's what treasures means. Treasures could mean that, and also
Well, I think you're giving the proper literal interpretation, namely that you think things get destroyed and your most expensive things get destroyed. But what's interesting, if it just had that one verse, I probably would have let it alone. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, the very idea of making a metaphor out of treasures, of being something that you could take with you, or something that relates to heaven, shows that the word treasures is obviously used in this ambiguous sense of referring to two very, very different things. Namely, there are treasures you could collect on earth. And listen, you could always just say, like, oh, be close with Jesus, love Jesus, do a lot of commandments, be nice to your people, and that's the treasures. So I thought it'd be actually interesting to do a quick diversion to look at rabbinic text, but not specifically what the rabbis call treasures for themselves, but what the rabbis say that God calls treasures. Right. That would be, I feel like that way it'll give us a better insight into verse 20. So I found 3 examples, and I'm going to read you 3 examples, and then we'll try to figure out a rule to try to understand how the rabbis view God's attitude towards treasure. So the first one is from the Babylonian Talmud, page 33b of Brachot, and it says, God has in his treasure house, in his storehouse, nothing but the fear of heaven. That's number one. What is God? If God has a treasure house, and in that, what does he store? He stores the fear of heaven. So that's ambiguous. It could refer to the feelings that people have, but I think it's very interesting. Let's go to the next one. The second one is any tears that fall from a kosher person, means a upstanding person, God counts and places inside of his storehouse, inside of his treasure house. That's the second one.
Mm-hmm.
And the third one, which I think is the most interesting, which I think I didn't circle. Okay, yeah. So when Moses went out to Mount Sinai, there's a whole thing that the angels didn't want to give up the Torah. The Torah was already sitting there since either the beginning of the world or something along that kind of perspective. So Moses went up, and then he had to kind of debate in front of God with the angels to kind of wrest away the Torah from. So it says that, where is it? Sorry, let me find the right text. You think I would have it? Okay, let's do this one. So that the Torah was put away into this form of storehouse by God for 900 generations, for not 900 generations, and now this man of bone, flesh and blood is coming to take it away. Does that make sense? Okay, sorry. Apparently, there's a fourth one, and the last one is that the souls of the righteous are stored in God's treasure house underneath his holy chair or his seat of holiness. So we have, to repeat, 4 things that God seems to keep in his treasure house. And you see they're contradictory, because one says this is the only thing he has, there's another thing, and there's probably 10 more Talmudic texts that relate this. But one is that God keeps the fear of heaven. Another one, God kept the Torah. Another one is that he keeps the tears
of the kosher person.
The tears that are cried, the tears that are cried about a kosher person.
About a kosher, okay.
Yeah, sorry, I said it wrong. About a kosher person. And the last one is he keeps the souls of the righteous that maybe aren't born, maybe after they die, who knows. So we have here, I think, very exciting that we have at least what it means to have God's treasure house. So if we had to think about maybe a general rule or a way to subsume all of these ideas under like maybe 1 or 2 concepts, what would you think the treasure of God relates to?
Wow. So we spoke. So it's we spoke about um, the fear of God, the fear of heaven, tears of a kosher person, the souls of the righteous, and then what's the fourth one? The souls of the righteous and
The Torah.
yeah, and the Torah. So if I have to group them all together, wow, because I
I'm
cannot.
not saying there's one rule,
Yeah.
but
So we cannot group them, right? Because the Torah would be a category in and all by itself. It's very unique. It's a different category. But then the fear of heaven, that's again. So we can probably group the tears of a kosher person and souls of the righteous maybe in one group because it involves people. But then when you take fear of heaven, that's even much more metaphysical.
yeah.
So
So would you again, like one way I was thinking about looking at it is that there's a certain eternality that Judaism wants to imbue upon these concepts. When the Torah is some form of, it existed for 900 generations. It was this eternal document. It didn't have this one moment in time. And also the fear of heaven. It sounds like God has almost like some clay, and he kind of dishes out fear of heaven to some people, and some people have it. There's actually interesting another Talmudic text that says that God can't control everything in the world except for the fear of heaven. It's that the way that human beings could kind of, there's God's treasure house that he has of his eternal stuff, then human beings could do things to earn their right inside of that treasure house. And just like the Torah has this kind of eternality to it, so too the tears could have an eternality to it. The fear of heaven could have an eternality to it, and the souls of the righteous could have an eternality. It just sounds like it's something that is metaphysically different, that's understood. That tear that was cried wasn't a tear. It was something that was deeper. It was something that's stronger. It was something that was godly.
So when you say fear of heaven, is that fear of God? Is fear of God is what is one meant by fear of heaven? Or then as secondly, right, we say 900 generations. What is it saying the time of Adam to the time of Moses? Is that they saying they had
if you do the math, I'm not sure according to the biblical account, there has even been 900 generations till today.
Because Matthew is 14, 14, 14, right? So you
well,
say 900.
Imagine the lifespan of someone like the Bible. If you do the math, it's like roughly 6,000 years. And if you imagine the lifespan of someone being 30 years, so 30 into 6,000 is, was that 200? So it's only according to the Bible been about that right? That's it's only been around 200 generations according to the Bible in human history from a literalist perspective, which is so forget about 900 generations. It could be like previous worlds or time of dinosaurs, who knows. But the point is that there's this idea that you could kind of earn a place in God's treasure house by doing certain things. It kind of transcends the physical world, certain things that you do. God's treasure house is a transcendental metaphysical thing. It's something that has like a special place in God's heart. Like you did a special thing. It's like almost like sometimes you hear like love letters are written between a husband and wife before they got married, and sometimes they'll be stored like that's like one of the special items in a relationship. So the tears or the souls or the fear of heaven that is expressed, all those things are super special, and they have like almost like this. They live beside God. They kind of leave the physical earth, and they exist in this metaphysical plane. Besides, according to the rabbinic understanding of God's understanding of treasure.
That's very profound, right? When I read the Old Testament and see how many times people cried and all the tears people shed, and if they're saying that all those tears were shed, all those tears are being kept in God's storehouse. I can't imagine I can't help but think
it's actually nicer. Let me read you the text again. It's actually a little bit nicer than even you're saying. Anyone who allows tears to leave his eyes or cries over a holy person or a stranger, God counts those tears and then places them into his storehouse. So it's not even the fact that he's keeping them. It's that God almost has like this intimate relationship. He's like, one, amazing.
Is this meant to be poetic or what? Is this like
100%? It's meant to be like it could have just said he kept in the storehouse. The fact that it has sofran, that he counts them, is definitely meant to be like, beautiful. You're supposed to have that additional level of that. Okay, let's go back to our that's enough rabbinic text for a little bit. Let's go back to our New Testament. So I think the first verse, you said it right. It refers to junk on earth. The things that you think are special, they're stolen, they rust, moths eat them, they're worthless. The physical stuff on earth. Junk. Possessions are here today, gone tomorrow. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. And I think we gave rabbinically a bunch of treasures in heaven examples. And I think we could look to our church fathers and see if how they define it. For example, we have one of them says Chrysostom, when he's driven away the disease of vanity, he does well to bring in speech of contempt of riches. So he takes it very literally. Get rid of vanity. When you get rid of vanity, you get rid of riches. Then you'll eventually. There's no greater cause of desire of money than love of praise, and it goes on almost as this follows the earlier attitudes of fasting and prayer and prayer and charity. That just like those things are things that you could use wrongly. So two possessions you can use wrongly. So he sees this verse kind of just follows naturally from the earlier verse completely. Okay, so what I want to point out now, when we look at this verse and just put Luke next to it, I think we have a very interesting idea. one thing that people love talking about is Jesus' attitude towards communism and or Marxism and or capitalism. And I think this is the main verse. So I think we'd be remiss if we didn't at least say that. So don't store up. There's a very big difference between store up. I think in different translations it says lay not up for yourselves, but it means don't have too much of treasures. And it doesn't say possessions. But when you look at Luke 12:33, it says, sell your possessions and give to charity. So I think these are meant to be two different attitudes towards Christendom, towards Christianity. On the one hand, one says, listen, live, have stuff, but realize that wealth is going to die with you. There's no reason to build wealth. Another attitude, I think, where we take this completely anti-hedonistic attitude and we take a completely an attitude of abstinence that we see in Luke, which would have been more fitting towards Luke than Matthew. We see don't own stuff. Stuff is bad. So what's interesting is the first in Matthew, we don't see stuff as bad. We see wealth is bad. And in Luke, we see sell your possessions. It's interesting how it says sell and not give away, but then it says sell your possessions and give alms. So it might be sell it to give it all away. It looks like it's a very anti-attitude towards possessions. So it's really interesting when we see these side by side. When a lot of times, I think when we look at the Gospels, we imagine the evangelist of one was always kind of presenting very similar ideas. But I think these are very opposite ideas and two different attitudes toward possessions in life. And when you look at the next verse, 20, Matthew, versus the second half of Luke 12:33, in Luke 12:33, it says, make purses for yourself and do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven where no thief comes and no moth destroys. So then they have, I think, the second attitude of create treasures for yourself is still there. You're still meant to do like they both presented as the opposite in comparison. In Matthew, we have don't amass treasures, but amass treasure in heaven. But in Luke, we have don't have stuff, but amass treasures. And it's interesting how they see both of those are two sides of the coin as two opposites. Because
but they use treasures in two different ways, right? So again, both of them in treasures on earth, as I mean, is physical treasures, or of monetary wealth, monetary wealth of physical treasures. But as in treasures in heaven, what they meant is that these things are fasting, almsgiving, and praying. Lord's Prayer. We spoke about praying and pray in secret. You fast in secret and give alms. Give alms give alms in secret. But they define treasures in heaven in a different way. It's not. It's not in this way. It's not in the physical sense. It's not related to monetary wealth.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really see a difference between the second half of Luke 12:33 and Matthew 6:20. In the English at least, it has "but store up for yourselves," and we don't have it as contrasted. But I think in Luke 12:33, it's kind of the same concept, in my opinion, as Matthew says. Make purses for yourself that do not wear out. He's saying if you want to keep stuff that is meaningful, do all the good stuff that make a purse for yourself, aka the metaphor of make yourself have these treasures in heaven. And he goes on, an unfailing treasure in heaven, as opposed to things that wear out. The real treasure is only the stuff that you earn that is in heaven, or the godly stuff. And again, I think this is very much the attitude that we see in the rabbinic perspective, that when you think about one of the goal of the world, if you imagine that your soul living on after death, then you're imagining a world in the next world where you have to do something to earn that. I mean, you can always imagine that, the gift of eternal life is just a gift just for believing. But if you imagine that it's stuff you have to do in this world, and it's more than just belief, then you almost are amassing wealth in the next world by all the good things you do. And I think that's the attitude that they're taking here. That, and that we have the personality attitude that you can't be, as we saw the church fathers say, you have to drive away the disease of vanity.
Yeah.
But then you also have and do good stuff. So those things exist side by side.
So in what way are Matthew different from these four rabbinical texts or within Judaism?
Well, Matt,
I'm hearing,
we don't know. I'm just using the rabbinic text as way. First of all, I didn't use the rabbinic text of how the rabbis define treasure for humans. I only use the way the rabbis define treasure for God. But again, I thought it'd be nice to have an attitude of a definition of treasure. In Matthew, Jesus never defines the treasures. It could have been obvious, and it could be like we're being overly analytical here. Like everyone in that time period might have just known, like, yeah, I feel like if I speak of the treasures of heaven and I go to a 10-year-old, I'm not sure a 10-year-old wouldn't understand what I'm talking about even today. So, but I feel like the rabbis were giving an attitude towards treasure in God's eyes. If we want, I could look for some rabbinic texts about how the rabbis view treasure in heaven from a human perspective. But I thought that'd be less interesting.
Yeah. so so one of my priests mentioned that within Judaism, doing charities of higher importance than within Christianity. Christians aren't. People are generous, but not in the way in which generosity is being
I
exhibited.
think in Judaism and Islam, it's not a Judaism thing. It's that prescription. We spoke about this about fasting. So people, when you fast, you're doing something nice. When I'm fast, it's the same thing of me just not driving 120 miles an hour on a highway. I'm keeping a law. When I give charity, I could be philanthropic and I could give more than I have to, but Jews have an obligation to give charity. When the temple is standing, you have to give a half shekel to the temple annually. And this is something that paid for the offerings throughout the year. And generally, we're supposed to give 10%, however, that's defined per year. And also, obviously, Muslims have their, as one of the five basic beliefs of Islam, they have to give charity. So I think when it's prescriptive versus advised, it's very different. And I feel like Christians, when you pass, I don't know, do you pass around the bowl in
Yeah.
church? So when you do that, if you don't put money in, is that a big deal?
No.
Yeah, exactly. So Jews also pass that around, and at one point during in certain prayers, but no one feels that's obligatory. So some people give, some people don't. But at certain times of year, there's obligations to give money, and I think everyone generally gives. Beginning of Nisan, right before Passover, there's generally a viewpoint that you're supposed to give money then, and I think everyone gives money, and everyone tries to give, like, when I calculate my salary, I try to figure out how much I'm giving away a year as part of a religious obligation. You hear a crazy story even that I know that when a synagogue was set up in Atlanta, I don't know if this story is true, but I heard that when the synagogue was set up, the head rabbi who set up that synagogue, he asked everyone to give over their taxes to him once a year so that he can make sure that they're giving 10% to charity.
Wow.
Because he wanted them to understand that giving the 10% to charity was not advisable. It was a legal obligation, just like not eating pig, just like not sleeping with someone else's wife. It's the same thing. You literally have a legal obligation. So he felt, I know how to read taxes. I'm going to make sure you give it. And he felt that what's more important, like, if you don't agree with that, there's other synagogues to go to. This is a synagogue that keeps basic laws. And one of the basic laws is to give 10% away to charity, however that's defined. And he wanted to make sure he wanted you to know that for you to be part of the synagogue, you should want him to do that. And if you don't want him to do that, then you shouldn't be part of the synagogue. Go to the other one that doesn't care.
That's quite something. Now, so here's what I'm trying to get towards, right? So giving 10% is so common. People in Jesus's time, again, his primary audience were mainly Jewish. When they heard, it's not Christians, it's not people like me with that Pauline antinomianistic view of things that are advised, right? So the audience in this place were primarily Jewish. What is the point of telling them something which they already know? Because as Jewish, they would have given tithes, they would have given 10%. And the folks that were not wealthy, they were
But
on.
it's not a charity section. This is on treasures, on possessions. This
Mhm.
is an attitude about just because you give 10% doesn't mean you can't amass wealth. For example, the rabbi said there's actually a cap on how much you're allowed to give away. You're actually not allowed to give away more, like, depends, like 20 or 33%. You're not allowed to give away more than the wealth than a certain level. So if you want to be more philanthropic, there's a cap on it in Judaism, because it's felt to be like, that's weird. So now that there's a cap, what are you supposed to do if you hit a certain level? Or what happens if you're just collecting rubies because you love gems and rubies back in the day, or gold? So Jesus is railing not about the too much charity or a lack of charity, but he's railing against this idea of the physical world will continue to exist. And you investing in the physical world is a mistake, according to Jesus. So I think that's the theme. Investment in this world is a world where he could have focused on your body will become worms, but he focused on your possessions will be eaten by worms or moths and will rust away and be destroyed. I think it's about his atemporal attitude towards the physical world.
Yeah, so
Very messianic
yeah,
attitude.
so it sounds very Jewish, right? Like as a Jewish person, do you find, like, is there anything
Yeah.
you disagree with this? I mean, he sounds very Jewish in this, and there isn't anything I found
Well,
different from.
so one thing, so this is, I agree it's Jewish, and about a massive, we could talk about amassing wealth in the next world by, doing commandments. I was told when I was a kid, I'll tell you another quick story, good story day. So there's a story I was told, I think in fourth grade, that imagine a king gave you 1 hour inside of a treasure chest that had unlimited diamonds and gold. So he gave you unlimited bags. So every time you filled up one bag of diamonds, the servants would tie the bag and bring another bag. So what happened? So you're shoveling diamonds and gold and money. So now it's 45 minutes in. Your arms can't move. Your shoulder is broken. Are you going to stop shoveling? He's like, of course you're not. You're going to keep shoveling until an hour. And it doesn't matter if you die or not. If you pass out from physical stress in your body, you can keep going. So that was the story. And then he said, when you wear tzitzit, the biblical garb, every second you wear those tzitzit, you fulfill commandment, it's like getting 5 cents in heaven. So every single second you're amassing wealth, literal wealth. This is how that's told in fourth grade. You're literally amassing wealth in heaven with every commandment that you do. So I think that would have been a very prevalent attitude in the first century, that when I do a commandment, I'm doing that. We also did have, as we mentioned Philo, who lived in Alexandria, and Philo did have metaphorical attitudes, and he definitely had a more Neoplatonic attitude towards the soul, and he would have been more philosophical about that. So it's not that in the first century when Philo lived, there weren't philosophers who would have viewed, like, just like how you kind of sometimes metaphorically roll your eyes at the idea of amassing wealth in heaven. There would have been people who would have also had that attitude, but I think the normal person, even today, when I do a commandment, I'm getting $1 to spend in the next life, or I'm getting a better seat in the arena of the next world. I think that would have been the common attitude towards wealth in that time period, putting aside Philo and his more philosophical beliefs. Okay, before we, sorry, would you like to say something?
No, yeah, that's all wonderful.
Before we finish, I just want to finish on verse 21, so we could say we finished one section of treasures. For where your treasure is there your heart will also be. First of all, I love how Luke has the same exact verse. This is the conclusion verse, and it couldn't be changed. This is the same thing as Luke 12:34. And I think it opens the door, which I don't want to go deep into the rabbit hole of what it means to have a heart in Judaism. But I do think it's very exciting that when you think of a heart, it obviously doesn't mean a heart today. It obviously means something, in this case, it probably means something more, it can mean either something more eternal, or in this case, it could mean where your heart is, that's what your desires have. I saw one translation, it actually adds the word desire of your heart. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is when we talk about the Shema, the monolithic creed of Judaism, the first paragraph says, you have to love God, with all your heart. And then it says, it says with all your possessions too. So what's interesting is that in Judaism, I think you do have this contrast that there's a way to serve God with your possessions that I think Matthew doesn't have a problem with, that Luke absolutely rejects. But in Judaism, these ideas of putting your possessions, it says, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your possessions. And there's an idea that everything you have should be devoted to God and going towards God. And I don't think that's an exactly parallel idea over here, but we do have this idea that you can't really talk about possessions without also talking about heart, without also talking about soul. If you want to talk about possessions, in order to put it into context, your possessions need to be used for the good. And I think that very much the opening line of the Shema in Deuteronomy very much parallels this idea of Matthew, that don't sell your possessions like Luke says. Don't store up your treasures on earth. Use the stuff for good and get rid of anything else you don't need. When you use it to serve God. And when it says there your heart will also be, it's really opening the door towards two interpretations. So for where your treasure is, there your heart will also be. Saying if your treasures are with the possessions, that's where your heart will be. If your treasures are with the heavenly treasures, that's where your heart will be. And you have a choice. And Jesus, like usual, sets it up as black and white with no gray area. Where I think in Judaism, we do have the gray area, that where do you want your heart to be? Where do you want your very essence to be? Where do you want your drive to be? Is your drive focused on this world or next world? And for Jesus, I think it's a black or white conversation again. It's this or that. And that's why Luke and Matthew, who I think have different attitudes towards possessions, can still finish with the same line. Because at the end of the day, your heart is only where what you're doing is. Mm-hmm. Anything, unless you're with that, I think we're done.
No, I think that's a great place to end, right? Where your heart is where your treasures will be, and that's a great place to be. And so, yes, I mean, with Jesus, there's some middle grounds, either this or that. It's either two different extremes, and even though Matthew and Luke take two different approaches, they can end on that note.
Great.
And I'm just been reflecting on what you've been saying, how, again, within Judaism, giving charity or these things aren't advised, but things you do, and that's his way of living. And that gives you a whole different way of looking at the scriptures than me as a Christian, where it's more, I see this as more optional. And again, being raised is more optional, as in fasting, alms giving, charity. And it's made me think and reflect on my faith and
It's
what this
interesting.
means.
Yeah, it means interesting. For what we've seen from the Lord's Prayer before this, is that Jesus, or from Matthew so far, is Jesus is definitely advocating a basic law and then a super arrogant attitude towards that law on top of that. And it's interesting. I just don't think Christianity today has that,
Yeah.
because the second that you have an antinomian and or non-basic law, then you can't have that attitude. And what's interesting, there are Christian law books from the 3rd, 4th, 5th century, even for the Code of Justinian. It's not like Christians don't have law books. It's just like, I think they're not kept anymore. If you want, we could go read some of the law books. But the main law book it's viewed is the New Testament. I feel that's your quote unquote law book.
Yeah,
But it's not really meant to be prescriptive. It's meant to be an addendum to an earlier text. Like, I think anyone who read the New Testament, Jesus just assumed they knew Pentateuch and they knew the Bible, unless you're a follower of Marcion, who rejected it, and that opened the door. And it's so interesting. I think Marcion, who rejected the Bible as either the Gnostic God, the evil God, or however you want to view it, but not being important. I think overall, like, while preachers today will read the Old Testament and use it, I just don't think it is that much part of a Christian's real life. And John is 1,000 times more. And I think in the end, Marcion kind of won. But it just shows you, like, a lot of these guys over time, a lot of the conversations I think the world we're living in the 21st century, it's a lot of arguments that lost over time are winning today. I think every day, especially when you think of like the LGBT community, or if you think of attitudes towards socialism that have kind of were lost in the last 100 years, they get able to be resurrected with newfound life. And I think that's what we see sometimes with the New Testament in reverse. That New Testament kind of always had the basic understanding that you really got to know Joshua, you really got to know Isaiah. And I think today Christians probably don't have that obligation. I think you and I would be hard pressed to find the Isaiah is probably the most important biblical text that the New Testament uses, aside from Psalms, obviously, or the Pentateuch. And I think we'd be hard pressed to find. Forget about a Jew, like Jew also, but it'd be hard pressed to find a Christian who's read through Isaiah and really knows Isaiah.
Now, I liked what you said, where Jesus starts with the law. He starts with the people who have the basic understanding of the law, and then from there he builds on the super aggregative model of what things are to be. But Christians, we don't work with that model. We start with we start with the New Testament mostly, and so without that basic understanding of the law, there is no way for us to define, or it's difficult to define the super or it's difficult to understand the super aggregative model which Jesus is pushing for. And so we end up using this in our modifying this to meet our context. But this section on fasting and alms giving has been very thoughtful. It's made me think and reflect and understand.
Yeah, I'll be honest. It was exciting to, like, when I read this verse, I was like, well, these 3 verses, like, well, we know what it means. So I thought it would be interesting to maybe find a new perspective to think about treasures and think about different ways to look at these things. Okay, let me turn this off. And
on that note, Rabbi, thank you.
Thank you.